Good morning.
Greetings.
Good morning.
Hello, we'll give it our minute or two for folks to join us. And then I think we got a short agenda today.
Sounds good.
How's everyone doing? Feel like while we wait, we should do some calisthenics, stretching, mental calisthenics, whatever.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Maybe for next time, I will start bringing a riddle or something like that.
That's fun.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah?
Make us think.
I'm
Not too
terrible
hard.
at riddles.
Yeah, so keep
Okay. all these stories where you gotta trick the devil or trick a genie or something like that with the riddle. I'm like, yeah, I'd just be dead.
Yeah.
Or I'd be the new genie or whatever. But I wouldn't be happy at the end.
Yeah.
As long as we don't make a rule which says that you only can join the meeting if you can solve the riddle, I think we are all good.
Yeah, no need to solve the riddle to participate.
That's perfect.
Yeah, good. Because I would definitely not be here.
Okay, we're 3 after now. So one other thing besides riddles that I resolved to start doing is introducing these meetings. So welcome everybody to the February 9th, 2021 meeting of SIG Multicluster. Laura, I think you're on the agenda, and I think you're the sole agenda item for today, although I've got one other little update that I'll give at the end around the work API stuff. So Laura, over to you.
Awesome, thanks. Can I get some screen sharing?
You can, yes.
Thanks. And in the spirit of a riddle, I am in a trivia league, and I can bring up the hardest question from my trivia league last week, which...
Let's do it.
Okay, the trivia question was, who is the historical figure that King Richard and Prince John from Robin Hood, the mother of King Richard and Prince John from Robin Hood is based on? I could not get this one. It was the hardest question of the week.
You lost me at Robin Hood.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't know that much about Robin Hood
Was it
more, so
the sheriff of GameStop?
Exactly, right. I think the weekly trivia was about Robin Hood because of the Wall Street bets. But the answer was Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was also queen of both France and England in her lifetime and went on the Second Crusade with her first husband, Louis the Seventh of France. So there you have it.
Wow, the double crown.
Double crown and a crusader. Very
I
busy
wonder
lady.
if the second time she was a queen, she was like, the first time when I was a queen,
was not enough.
This is what our SREs did. And those are, of course, slop reliability engineers, because I think there's animals eating slop during that historical period.
I do think so. All right. Well, trivia aside, I am now attempting to share my screen. And
I can see it.
Excellent. So I want to give an update about cluster ID. And in particular, I went through, I made a new PR bumping the diff for sections that needed to be filled out to try and get to implementable. Then I also tried to fill in as much as I could, including some more user stories from my travels to talking to Cluster API. I went to see SIG Cluster Lifecycle today also. So definitely comments encouraged, but I also wanted to take the time today to give an opportunity for people to provide input about some of the majorly unresolved points, especially the ones that I didn't feel like I could like totally answer on my own. And then confirm the next steps for going to implementable, which is my major goal here. So yeah, I think everybody on the call has already seen this slide a million times, but if you haven't been following about Cluster ID, this is the background. But what I think is outstanding on the pull request right now, which again, there's a new one linked down here and I have it open and over on the side in case you need to reference it, is how exactly do we associate an ID with a cluster? How do we associate a cluster with a cluster set? How do we deal with previously isolated clusters joining a cluster set, which we had punted on quite a bit before? Can we or should we recommend or enforce that people don't drop arbitrary JSON as the value to a claim, either one of our well-known ones or a claim somebody just makes themselves? And what are we going to do about the effect of UUIDs versus human readable names for cluster ID on DNS, at least within this KEP? Do we need to address it within this KEP or not? It's come up a little bit in the prior iteration. So this is kind of a lot of things, and I do have individual slides here with my takes, and would like to go through them one by one if we can, take opinions. This first one, how do we associate an ID with a cluster? I did put about this in the pull request, which is maybe sufficient, but it actually came up today when I went to SIG Cluster Lifecycle, the question of what obligation might cluster lifecycle platforms have to create this ID? Is that something that we should be discussing now, that we should explicitly call out? Besides the fact that we think it could be created cluster local, especially for using Kube system ID, like do we need to specify who's actually doing that? And is there any other tooling that we expect would actually make this ID at cluster creation? So that's my first salvo. Any feelings?
Go ahead, Paul.
No, I refuse. You go ahead.
Okay.
I think, in reading your draft, I think you've done a good job of kind of setting out the obligation, which is like you're obligated if your customers expect to be using the cluster ID. But I don't think, we're mandating, we're saying, ideally this ID would eventually exist in all clusters. That seems pretty useful, but I don't think we're making any really strong statements about that. So I think, our answer might be, no answer, strong suggestion to create it, but no mandates. And then in terms of what tooling could create the ID, I think we've specifically not answered that, right?
Right.
Sorry. Please go ahead. No, I will go last. I will have the last word. So you go ahead.
Sorry. So I have a quick question. This is just my second meeting, so maybe I'm just catching up on some of these details. Sure. So the idea of the cluster ID, thank you. The idea of the cluster ID, this is the same thing that was also sent out as a SurveyMonkey link, right? Like what do we call it and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So the notion of a cluster ID and then the notion of cluster sets and everything is a generic thing for multiple possible multi-cluster use cases, correct? This is not specifically tied to Work API.
Correct.
Okay, so
for any multi-cluster setup, and relatedly, for example, when I went by to talk to Cluster API, they are in a world where they have management clusters that have like workload clusters for Cluster API, and that's like a valid use case, for example.
Got it. So the question is, if you have multiple clusters and some of them maybe in existence even today, how do you assign them not just an ID as an identifier, but have multiple like it should be an object so that it can capture multiple different configuration details of what the cluster has, what the cluster is capable of. And then if multiple clusters, each of them have this, you can put them all together as a set of clusters and then do other interesting, solve for interesting multi-cluster use cases after that, correct?
I think mostly correct. I got a little lost in the middle there about.
So let me ask one at a time then. So when we say cluster ID, are we talking just about coming up with a unique ID, like a UUID for the cluster, or are we talking about having it as an object and have multiple details in that object?
The proposal right now is pretty simple to only be basically the name of the cluster, which our official recommendation is it should probably be the Kube system namespace UUID, because that is like most likely to be globally unique, but the official properties that we've written in the KEP don't require it be that specifically. That's just our recommendation. And yeah, the actual storage is just the CRD that's proposed is just that one value and not any other information it attached to like that one object. And then the cluster set would also be just a simple name as my proposal as well too. But I think one thing to your more general point about more complicated information, we do leave room for users to add any arbitrary objects into the same cluster claim CRD that could be other information. And that's kind of like the stopgap for if they wanted to have other configuration, but we just described like the minimal thing that we think people need for our multi-cluster use cases.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you foresee any relationship to this ID to, I guess, what's the context in the context today with the config context? So when I'm switching context with kubectl, for example.
My guess is that they kind of serve a different purpose, but I do know that one of the things that attracted Cluster API, for example, to this proposal was as a admin of lots of clusters that are being created through Cluster API. In whatever context that you're in, you can just do a quick like kubectl git cluster claim idk.io and you know where you are, and that it's like easy. So I think from an administrator and context perspective, that might be related. But I think for the multi-cluster services purposes, I think the most important thing is that there is a cluster local thing inside natively that we can query for the controller to the MCS controller to decide, can this can this cluster be in this cluster set or not?
I think the idea of linking it to contexts is interesting, but it requires some active process to either fetch all of the IDs from all of the clusters in a set, or some sort of gateway that would translate those into actual API endpoints. But I think it's an interesting idea.
All right, well, I think, Paul, did you want to have your last word on this slide?
Sure, and I was, of course, joking about having the last word, but so I think, to me, the primary decision that we should make is like, you absolutely have to have a cluster ID to be part of a cluster set. And even though we're agnostic on how this will use them, we don't want to make like hard dependencies into cluster ID. Like, we want things to depend on cluster ID. Cluster set is like kind of one of the main ideas that is connected with this. So I guess the question is, do we think it should exist before you join a cluster set? It absolutely has to exist for you to join a cluster set or to be part of a cluster set. I'm hearing, and maybe I heard it wrong, but what I heard so far is that we think it's useful to have before. Is that accurate? Like, it should exist to be the most useful just naturally, whatever that means.
I think that it's one of those, like, if you build it, they will come situations. And
Yeah.
the more clusters have this, the more people will find interesting ways to use it.
Yeah. I think I agree. And so my gut, like my kind of intuitive version of what I think that would mean is that a thing that might be useful would be a controller that initializes it from the namespace of the UID of the of the default namespace. Or is that the right one? Sorry, I'm a little distracted.
I think cube system is
Cube
the
system,
one we've been
that's
talking
right,
about.
yeah. So a controller that initializes it based on that, I think would be a useful piece to have. And maybe if you don't want that behavior, if you want to initialize it some other way, you can disable that controller. My gut impression.
Yeah, I think to combine both of these for the immediate term, I think, and by both of these, I mean what Jeremy was saying earlier, maybe we don't need to explicitly, mandate that in the KEB. Maybe we can mention it. And I do think we have sort of consolidated around it, probably existing, could exist before, but I won't plan to make a really strong, like, this must be implemented by a independent controller that, runs before this or runs before that, or SIG cluster or cluster lifecycle managers need to make sure that they make this cluster ID, blah, blah, blah. I don't think we're that far.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Well, like I love the idea of having a controller that automatically initializes this, and we encourage everybody to use it all the time in every cluster. But I am also thinking about this from the context of someone who's, got clusters or they've got a cluster and they're just entering into the multi-cluster world, and, they've ignored everything that we've ever said until that point. And so, we give them the easy onboarding. So like the mandate that it must exist to be a part of a cluster set, like that's the must. And then, but we should always have an ID. But I don't know if we can mandate that yet, unless we actually got this like built in.
Yeah, and here's a little brain teaser. Say that it's built in. Yeah, on the theme of riddles, here's in trivia and thought puzzles. Here's one. So if we get it built in, what does it mean for clusters that are older than the first version where it shows up? Do you define a CRD and use it that way?
Yeah, this feels kind of related. Maybe this is a good segue into, I'm skipping one kind of, but there's a point of how do we associate a cluster with a cluster set, and also how to deal with previously isolated clusters joining a cluster set. So
right.
To open this up.
So what would the sequence of events be? So let's say I have 5 clusters. Do I go and, whether it is manually install a CRD or run a controller that installs a CRD and that creates maybe a CR, in each of these 5, let's say my ultimate objective is all these 5 clusters together should form one cluster set. So do we go ahead and one way or the other install a cluster ID CR in each of these 5 clusters, and then create one cluster set custom resource in one of these 5 clusters, or do we create the cluster set in all 5?
Cluster set in all 5.
So they all know about the membership,
so
who else?
Yeah, they all know their membership, exactly.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
They all know their own membership. They don't all know each other's.
Correct.
Right. So they know which cluster set they are part of and who else is part of the same cluster set.
Only the first part.
Yeah, only the first part. They don't know who else is that stored in this CRD. They don't know who else is their cluster set friends.
But then something or some controller or someone should have the full details of the entire cluster set membership, right?
Yeah, and this is the words I have used basically in the PR right now to describe this is basically just like MCS controller, which is defined in the MCS API as something that has knowledge of all the clusters, but could just be a person running kubectl. Should figure it out basically, but I don't know if we need to be a bit more detailed in this KEP.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So this might be a bit of a complex question, perhaps not the, well, maybe it doesn't really have use cases that make sense for it, but what about clusters that would like to be members of multiple cluster sets?
Yeah, we have purposefully put that in non-goals for now. It did come up on the original PR though. And I think we talked about it briefly like a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was even in the end of December. But it has been asked, but we have respectfully declined, I think, for now.
Well, I think we actually talked about this a few times, you know, starting back with multi-cluster services API, and even when we were just discussing like the principle of namespace sameness.
Yeah.
And since the properties of belonging to a cluster set are transitive, then you can't, it doesn't seem like you could really have a cluster belong to multiple cluster sets without kind of requiring that those cluster sets are one cluster set.
Right. Yeah, I remember the namespace sameness angle of things leading to that. Yeah.
And I think whenever we talked about it most recently when I was present, we kind of were talking about, if we think of this as like the Venn diagram, actually it's that like, you know, we filled the paint into both sides of the Venn diagram. They're actually just the same group now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember it the same way. I do think this might be something, it might be an area where we get feedback from the community after it goes into implementable. So we can just keep an eye on that.
All right, well, to bring this back to the current point, I think we agree that there is some MCS controller above the cluster local boundary who needs to figure out stuff about whether a cluster can be associated with a cluster set. Is there any more conversation about any more specifics of how we want to deal with previously isolated clusters joining a cluster set? I think, you know, if the cluster ID is really like unique beyond the boundary of all cluster sets, then it's easy. But since we don't prescribe that, then it's possible that a cluster could get rejected when it tries to join a cluster set. And is there like a flow we think is likely or relevant here that we're imagining? That's how that would shake out.
I think that we're, in a way, we're kind of describing some of the cluster set behaviors, and maybe the boundary's a little hazy, but I think one thing that we could define is what happens if you try to join a cluster set where the cluster ID appears to already be in the set.
Right.
As a thing that we could try to solve.
Yeah, I think that is a case that covers a lot of this, including this previous potential drama with the previously isolated clusters, and also just generally, if people are willing to make cluster IDs that aren't super unique, they'll run into this problem. So it's a good platonic case.
Yeah, I do think that another like form of this case is the one where cluster ID is part of the KK API, and in the sense that like cluster claim or cluster fact or whatever is, and what does that mean for clusters that are older?
Right.
The answer might be that it means that you can't use it. Like, I don't know that that's the best answer, but it's an answer. Another one might be, you know, like we could publish a CRD and a controller that populates that CRD for people to run in their clusters. So that seems like it's a related question that's very much in the neighborhood.
Right. And then building off that too, and I think this is something that's come up, is how would you migrate from a CRD version of an API to an in-tree version of the exact same API?
Yeah, the interesting rub there is you can't have the same API group in both the CRD and a built-in. And so very likely what we end up with is there's an API group for the CRD and there's a different API group for the built-in, and we have to teach cluster set implementations. You have to respect both in some precedence order.
Complex.
Yeah, this does not sound super friendly.
Sorry, what is KK?
Kubernetes core, the core API.
The main GitHub repo.
Got it.
It's too many syllables, so we just abbreviate.
That's fine. That's fine. Thanks.
Let me just throw out a wildly overcomplicated solution to an imaginary problem.
Nice.
And like, I guess what we could do is we could teach the thing that existed in KK could be sensitive to the presence of the CRD. So the first time that thing starts, it could check for that and populate it. If you're already using the CRD, you upgrade into a version that has it in KK, populate it there, have the one that's in KK take precedence. And maybe if we want to just like absolutely over-engineer this thing, 5 nines of over-engineering, it could like self-destruct the CRD one after you install or after it comes online. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, we did something similar when we migrated from our own service discovery APIs to the MCS APIs. So we had a controller that just took the old API. Whenever an object was created, it created a new one, deleted the old one, and then the existing, well, the real behavior was just mapped to the new CRD, and that worked quite well. So old code could create, well, yeah, so this works for stuff that's create only. Then you need webhooks for other stuff, probably. But,
Right.
The reason, I guess, this can't always be a controller and a CRD is because CRDs by themselves have all kinds of other limitations. They need to be explicitly installed and stuff like that. Is that the reason why we want to eventually make this part of KK?
It seems like being part of KK is the best way to guarantee that it's always present. I don't know that we're actually relying on any specific KK behaviors. I mean, there's like guaranteeing that it always exists with the with the UID of the kube system namespace. If we wanted to be that prescriptive, seems like that would be easiest to implement in tree, because what you can do with KK resources, there's a lot more flexibility than CRDs. But I don't know that, like, for the most part, I mean, it's such a simple resource. I don't know that it really needs, that it matters.
Separate, yeah.
To the functionality.
Is there a precedence on something that originated as a separate thing, but the controller eventually got merged with the core Kubernetes components? Because if that happens, then I guess this problem could be solved, right? Where it starts off as a CRD and a controller, and people need to explicitly install those. But at some point when it's mature, the controller kind of code starts merges with the rest of the core Kubernetes components. So it still is supported, but it doesn't need to be explicitly installed when people install or upgrade Kubernetes. With the API versions that they install, these API versions will also get installed. Is that an option?
I'm not aware of precedent.
I can't readily think of one either. How about you, Tim?
No, I'm racking my mind, but I don't think that we've done that.
I've also heard elsewhere that it's not really a thing.
That's sort of the reason why CRDs were created.
Yeah. Yes.
So
okay.
not exactly, but it's sort of like it's connected with. But I think that's a good question to ask.
I mean,
yeah.
If it has to start, it has to start somewhere. Maybe it could be this. But anyway, I'll leave it to you guys, of course.
Right. What about the idea of starting? And I think we started talking about this with MCS in the early days, and maybe gave up a little bit. But what about an in-tree CRD?
Meaning it's in the KK repo.
Yeah, installed at startup.
It's installed at startup, but it's
startup
a
of
CRD.
What?
The universe.
Yeah. First boot of the API server. Yeah.
So then how's it upgraded? When the new API server comes online, it sees a new version, but then you have multi-instance control planes. So are you going to fight over it, or are you always going to be only moving forward? Like, it has been discussed. There are some bumps that haven't really been solved. And honestly, SIG sort of let this ball drop. And so maybe we need to reopen it. I'm honestly not sure what the storage folks are, the folks that were sort of pioneering here. I'm not sure what they actually ended up on.
Right. And I think actually this is one of the reasons why we dropped that approach for MCS, at least for now, and just kind of went straight out of tree. Because there's some open questions, but it does seem like, assuming we could solve those questions, that would solve the other problems with traditional KK not being able to coexist with CRDs and whatnot.
Yeah, I think so. TLDR, my position on that is we totally could do that. We could try to be the driving force to sort out within SIG Arch how to handle in-tree CRD APIs. We absolutely could do that. Or we could just say, for now, as one other possibility, not the only one, but another choice we could make would be to say that that we're just not going to worry about it for now, and we're going to concentrate on getting something into an alpha state that's an in-tree API. And we could see what demand there is, and decide if we need to handle that problem in the future. I think a fallback could be that, like, maybe there's a CRD version that you can run in older clusters, and maybe that CRD version is sensitive to the cluster version and stops working and tells you it stops working when it finds the in-tree API. But we sketched out some of those precedent mechanics, what they might look like in our discussion here today. So I think that could be a fallback. My gut would be that, if we want to solve in-tree CRDs, that's probably a much larger problem space than what we're actively working on. And I would hate to see our work get distracted by that problem.
I agree. I agree completely.
All right, well, let's table that one for now, I think. What I'm getting from the question about how do we associate a cluster with a cluster set specifically is, I think this what happens if you try and join a cluster set where the cluster appears to already be in the set is the good platonic case scenario to describe. And then I can take a stab at it, and then maybe people can chime in with their comments. But I do think we need to describe it in the KEP that we have thought about it.
Yeah, I think that if we say that we're going to focus on like getting something in tree to alpha, and that will handle older clusters that may not have the in-tree API in the future, that would be a fine thing to say, but it absolutely does deserve explicit treatment in the KEP.
And just for devil's advocate, in putting on one of my other hats, why does it need to be built in? Is there something in tree that in core that is using it, or is it simply that we want ubiquity? Because actually CRD will probably give us better ubiquity. So it's a question we need to answer, right? I love the built-in APIs. What is the advantage of a built-in for this?
My own answer to that off the top of my head is that if it is a CRD, like you now need to make a choice. How are you going to release that? Are you going to release a chart? Are you going to release a bunch of YAMLs? Like, how are you going to release it? And what's the best way to do that has the widest spread of people, but is also that can use it or won't have to make a new choice in order to use your installation method, and that you can just completely short circuit that question by being in tree. But yeah, my own top of the head gut answer. I don't know if that makes sense.
The other thing that also comes with a CRD is the entire management cycle of it. So there's installation is one, but then you also have to make sure that you keep upgrading it, especially if it in some way ties to the Kubernetes version. So if someone upgrades the cluster, then you also have to make sure that the CRDs and the controllers are upgraded in some corresponding fashion. If there are things that you need that, and then it just adds more complexity, right? Like, let's say the Kubernetes version needs to be upgraded, but the controller version needs to be behind. How do you keep that on track? And then everything that comes with it, how do you message it to users and stuff like that? So in-tree would definitely be useful, but I guess given that, maybe to begin with, I guess CRD might be a good choice to get started, just to get initial feedback on what people think. Sorry.
So I'm not sure that there's going to be much by way of active controller here, nor much by way of schema change over time. Like we're intentionally scoping this down to like one single data point, right? So some of those issues are somewhat mitigated. Now those are famous last words, and that's never blown up in anybody's face before. There isn't a good migration path, like, other than just saying like the alpha doesn't work anymore and don't upgrade your cluster if you have the alpha version. Like I don't honestly know what happens if I install an API group as a CRD and then I upgrade my cluster to a version that has one that's a built-in. Like that upgrade path, I think, is just untrodden. I had another point and I lost it. I forgot what my point was. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, I've taken some notes. I think this is driving with just this broader and still continuing, like in-tree, out-of-tree. Now it's like CRD, in-tree CRD concept too. So I don't think we'll 100% solve it today, but this is some good notes for me, and hopefully I can synthesize this together to address this concern from an implementation perspective. Is it all right if I move on to the next one, unless anybody has more strong feelings?
I guess the only thing that I'll point out is I think this is like the choice we make around this is important. Whatever choice we make isn't really permanent until it goes to something more mature than alpha. So like, I think sometimes also when you make that like choice, you immediately are like, I've made a terrible mistake. So like, we don't need to overthink it. maybe we can do a poll type thing and see what people find most appealing, but let's just remember that we have the ability to like reevaluate any decision that we make there. So let's not make it a thing that blocks us.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. I've got 2 more questions, which I think are a little easier. Can we or should we recommend or enforce that people don't drop arbitrary JSON as a value to a claim, either well-known or custom user claim? So we think these will be short, comparatively short strings, but someone else brought this up that this is a risk, I guess, with our very general schema. So I think there's some options of increasing severity here, but I'll take thoughts on this.
Well, this actually connects with like the last decision we were kind of circling. So if we want to use a CRD and we want to keep the distribution pretty easy, like, you know, ideally we have like a couple of YAMLs if we're choosing a CRD. It means that we would be really smart to stick with what open API schema validations can give us rather than having to have an emission webhook. Because as soon as you've got an emission webhook, you got an API service, you got a deployment, you got a service, you got all kinds of stuff. So if we want to have like as the severity, like as you go further down the severity spectrum or up or whatever, the complexity of the thing also will tend to increase. So we should think about like, are we comfortable with what CRD schema validation could give us?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. Also, in terms of enforcing, like not dropping arbitrary JSON, like I think having arbitrary JSON in a claim would be gross, personally, and you know, not the best experience for someone who's like listing claims. But what's really wrong with it? You know, if it's that we don't like it, that's like, you know, there's arbitrary JSON kind of all over the place. People stick JSON in annotations. Like, I think like there's valid reasons to do that, and it solves real problems. But also, not allowing JSON doesn't prevent, like, you know, base 64 encoded JSON and all kinds, like someone can find, if they want to stick garbage in a claim, they can work around it. And JSON is cleaner than base 64 encoded JSON. So
okay.
I would.
So true. And point taken.
Yeah.
All right, so that's more in the favoring of not caring or maximum say something in the kit that's like, probs don't do this, but you do you.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but I am not hearing that there's a huge appetite for being really strict about it. Though there's observation that if we do feel we need to go strict about it, that affects our CRD versus core conversation.
I skew permissive on this one as someone that was like implemented a lot of very restrictive things initially that were wildly unpopular around secret keys and stuff like that. Like, give the people what they want.
I wasn't going to pin that on you, Paul, but you're right. It's your fault.
I didn't say it was my fault. I said I did the work.
I'm pretty sure that I collaborated in that mess.
Yeah.
But I agree here. I'm not sure that being super duper restrictive is actually going to be helpful. We can define what we think the well-known names have for values, but at the end of the day, you have a resource, like maybe we put a size cap on it, but that's probably it.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, the only thing I feel really strongly about here is avoiding a webhook.
Okay. Great. All right. And then the last one I have here is, what are we going to do about the effect? This was pulled from some of the comments on the prior PR of UIDs versus human readable names for the cluster ID specifically. And in particular, people were worried about it for DNS, and at least within this KEP, I feel like we could say it's out of scope for this one. We could bring up that we think aliases should be a thing later because that's come up. We could describe aliases in more detail. And then I have some questions of what people think that might ever look like if we're talking about that now, but I don't know which level of severity we're on for this one.
I would skew heavily towards saying it's out of scope. Like, UIDs are not the most human friendly, but you know, we do leave the door open for human friendly names. But aliases are a whole topic, and everybody has their own opinions. And I think like we probably do need to discuss that, but we can do so entirely separately. I also think that's a big part of the, like, what aliases could mean and all of that is a big part of what stalled the original attempt at a cluster ID.
And can I associate labels with cluster IDs? And if so, can't I use that as essentially any alias I want to anyway?
Right. Yeah, maybe that's how we alias things.
I agree. Absent concrete use cases right now, aliases are a future feature. I think we have very tangible value in very unique IDs, whether they're universal or not, to be decided. But
yeah, same.
All right, cool. I accept this. All right, so I continue trudging along towards implementable. The definition of implementable is that the approvers have approved this KEP for implementation. So it has its definition in it, but I think the next steps, I'm going to update the pull request with what we just discussed. I'll solicit and wait for comments, especially around this, how to deal with previously isolated clusters in a cluster set and resolve them, and eventually get Paul to approve me. And then this is a bit more future thinking, but I think this is where we would be going after at some point. I'm just trying to cue myself up. This might be getting a little ahead of myself. And especially since we were just talking about in-tree so much, so maybe this isn't even worth talking about now. But this is what I think happens after that at some point.
Yeah, I think those are right. I like the reference with the question marks and profit.
Right.
I think we got a lot closer to implementable today. I see the central question being, do we want in tree or out of tree? And one thing that I'll just note is that, like, I think we're writing a KEP because we expect this to be in tree. And so I've kind of had that expectation present. My gut says that's probably the best way, but like maybe we can all chat in SIG Multicluster about how do we want to make that decision. Like,
gotcha, yeah,
SIG
like
Multicluster channel of Slack, so that we don't have to wait another week to talk about it.
Right. I think you even brought up something about like polling or some sort of like democracy about this too, is a possible route. But I think we would at least need to articulate all the pros and cons of our options so that people could make an informed decision if we go that way.
And honestly, we should race to the next stage where we can actually learn more about the use cases and how people are going to use this. And if it turns out that doing it as a CRD was a mistake, then it's a mistake we can all live with, I think.
Yeah, but I also want to call out, I think last time we discussed this too, because this is kind of a hard decision. And one of the things we came up with was, like, if other people want to use it, like if we go to SIG Cluster Lifecycle and they want to use it, then in-tree probably makes more sense. And Laura, you went to SIG Cluster Lifecycle and they want to use it.
Right.
So, maybe we could just decide and move ahead and see what happens.
Yeah, I'm happy to go around to some more too. I mean, I did get that some names of other SIGs that maybe would be interested. I need to check my notes, but if we want more info, I guess. But for right now, I'll focus on getting this kept to what I think is implementable, and then do a call for comments and start resolving those.
Okay. I'll throw out something that can be a useful way to provoke a response.
Okay.
Sometimes, when a decision appears to be made, people care 10,000% more than they did before it was made.
Gotcha, yeah.
So here's the method, is sometimes if I'm trying to pick between two things, I will go open my internet web browser and go on over to random.org, and I will pick one of the coin flips and I will flip 3 or 5 coins, call it in advance, and that's the decision. And sometimes like just making that decision, even if it's like you just let atmospheric noise or whatever random.org uses to seed their number generators with, like make it for you, people suddenly have a strong opinion. So we might just keep that in our bag of tricks for something to do so that we don't get paralyzed.
Roger that. All right, I will cede the floor to you, Paul, for your last update.
It's super quick. The work API repo was created. I've been asked Chojin to translate his doc into a markdown there, so we can start adding details and asking ourselves, is that implementable enough to put some code behind? EOF.
The work API sounds exciting. I'm really looking forward to it.
I think you raised a PR, didn't you?
I did, but yeah, it was mostly for just kind of settings, just kind of making sure that I have the access to the repo and whatnot. And turned out I actually did not, and there was a step missing with the CLA and all that. But so yeah, if there is any way I can contribute, I'll be happy to. So yeah, let me know.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I LGTM and approved that PR that added the link back to SIG Multicluster earlier today.
Yes,
so that should be
merged. It's merged now. So thanks a lot for that.
No problem. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot, Laura. Excellent discussion today. And we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. See ya.